Listen, sweetheart, that's not how you torque composite materials on a stealth prototype. The classified test pilot emergency device in Sarah Catherine Walsh's tool belt buzzed with the distinct tone that could ground America's most advanced aircraft programs in minutes. "I'll adjust the torque specification immediately, Major." Her voice carried the practiced deference of someone who'd spent the week maintaining aircraft for pilots who had no idea she commanded the nation's experimental flight test operations. What Major Rick Thompson didn't know was that the young blonde mechanic adjusting his prototype's wing panels outranked him by 2 grades and was about to receive a call that would change everything. Click. Thompson tapped his flight helmet against the aircraft's titanium hull, the sound echoing through Edwards Air Force Base's classified test hangar. And next time, make sure maintenance staff understands that experimental aircraft require precision, not guesswork. Sarah's fitted blue coveralls and form-fitting work pants had drawn appreciative glances all week. At 29, she maintained the athletic build that came from years of military flight training, though none of the test pilots watching her work suspected she'd earned her expertise commanding experimental aviation programs across 3 classified facilities. The test pilot emergency device buzzed again. Priority escalation. "Major, I understand the importance of precision," Sarah said quietly, her blonde hair catching the hangar's fluorescent lighting as she leaned over the prototype. "Aircraft maintenance can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." That's when the emergency device rang with the tone that would expose everything. "Stories like this prove that heroes lead from every position in our military. Tell us where you're watching from. What city, state, or country?" Staff Sergeant Mike "Wrench" Harrison had been watching the new mechanic for 2 days now, and something felt inconsistent. It wasn't obvious at first. Sarah Catherine Walsh moved through Edwards AFB's classified test hangar with practiced efficiency, her fitted coveralls flattering her athletic figure while maintaining professional boundaries. Blonde hair pulled back during procedures, nothing suggesting she was anything more than what she appeared. But Harrison had 12 years of experimental aircraft experience, and he'd learned to recognize specialized training. The way Sarah handled prototype components wasn't standard maintenance protocol. She used calibration techniques that suggested advanced aeronautical engineering training. When she performed system diagnostics, she employed procedures that indicated flight test operations knowledge. When she navigated the restricted hangar, she moved with the spatial awareness of someone who understood experimental aircraft security protocols. Most telling was how she assessed flight systems. Sarah Catherine Walsh evaluated everything with pilot-level comprehension. Not obviously, she never overstepped her apparent role as maintenance specialist. But Harrison noticed her unconsciously analyzing aircraft performance parameters with diagnostic precision. Yesterday, when Major Thompson discussed flight envelope testing, Sarah had worked nearby much longer than necessary, her eyes tracking technical specifications with unmistakable aviation expertise. "Harrison, you're staring again," Technical Sergeant Johnson mentioned during yesterday's shift. "Just observing work efficiency," Harrison replied. But it was more than that. This morning's incident confirmed his suspicions. Most maintenance specialists would have apologized profusely when corrected by a test pilot. Sarah Catherine Walsh had done neither submission nor defensiveness. She'd listened carefully, processed the technical authority structure, and responded with calm professionalism that suggested experience managing difficult personalities in high-pressure flight situations. Her body language hadn't shown intimidation. If anything, she'd looked patient, like someone waiting for a student pilot to finish ground school. The classified device buzzed again, its tone cutting through the hangar's constant background noise like an air traffic control alert. But what Major Thompson didn't know was that Colonel Sarah Catherine Walsh had been conducting her own investigation. As the commanding officer of America's most classified experimental flight test program, she had access to personnel evaluations and facility reports for every test installation under her jurisdiction. Edwards AFB's experimental division showed concerning patterns. Nothing dramatic, but subtle indicators suggesting bias issues affecting operational safety. Anonymous feedback mentioned feeling dismissed by certain test pilots. Mission readiness scores fluctuated inconsistently. Most troubling were reports about how different maintenance staff and support personnel were treated based on gender and perceived experience level. So Colonel Walsh decided to investigate personally. For 1 week, she'd observed how authority functioned at squadron level, how respect was earned or demanded, how chain of command operated when no stars were visible, how pilot ego affected maintenance cooperation and flight safety. The experimental test facility represented the cutting edge of American aviation technology. Pilots here flew aircraft that wouldn't enter service for another decade. The margin for error was 0. Team cooperation wasn't just professional courtesy, it was national security necessity. But Colonel Walsh had noticed troubling patterns in how technical input was valued. Maintenance recommendations from certain demographics were questioned more rigorously. Safety concerns from female technicians required additional verification. Expertise was often measured by appearance rather than demonstrated competence. These weren't just personnel issues, they were flight safety risks. When maintenance staff felt dismissed or undervalued, they became less likely to voice critical safety observations. When technical expertise was judged by gender or age rather than knowledge, vital information got filtered out of decision-making processes. Colonel Walsh knew that America's experimental aviation advantage depended on leveraging every qualified mind, regardless of packaging. But what they didn't realize about this skilled 29-year-old mechanic would change everything at Edwards Air Force Base. "What exactly is that noise?" Major Thompson demanded, his voice carrying across the classified hangar. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the device, then stopped. "I apologize, Major. Equipment monitoring alert." "Equipment monitoring is handled through proper test channels." Thompson gestured toward the official facility communication system. "Young lady, this is exactly the problem with civilian contractors in experimental aviation facilities. No understanding of proper flight protocols." "Major," Staff Sergeant Harrison interjected carefully, "maybe we should keep technical discussions private. Maintenance staff sometimes overhear sensitive." "Harrison, she's a mechanic. She adjusts bolts and changes hydraulic fluid. That's it." Thompson gestured dismissively toward Sarah, who continued preparing diagnostic equipment with mechanical precision. "These civilian contractors sometimes forget their place in aviation hierarchy. Important to maintain proper boundaries." The device buzzed a third time. Crisis escalation. Sarah's athletic frame tensed slightly as she recognized the escalation pattern. Somewhere in American airspace, an experimental aviation emergency was developing that required her immediate strategic assessment. The same assessment that had prevented 2 classified aircraft losses in the past 6 months. "The problem with hiring attractive women for technical positions," Thompson continued, his voice deliberately loud enough for Sarah to hear, "is that they think their appearance entitles them to opinions about complex systems. But this is experimental aviation. Beauty doesn't earn respect. Technical competence does." Captain Lisa Phoenix Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, perhaps we should lower our voices." "Should what?" "Pretend everyone's technical opinion is equally valid." Thompson warmed to his theme. "That's exactly the thinking that compromises flight safety. You need to understand that test pilot hierarchy exists for a reason. Flight hours matter. Engineering knowledge matters. Adjusting bolts doesn't mean understanding aerodynamic principles." Sarah moved closer to their conversation, her movements carrying subtle authority that seemed at odds with the humble mechanic role Thompson described. Technical Sergeant Tank Williams watched carefully. 15 years in experimental aviation had taught him to read people, and something about Sarah's calm confidence suggested institutional knowledge beyond civilian contracting. "Sir," Williams said quietly to Thompson, "maybe we should keep it down. Some conversations?" "Williams, she's a contractor. She maintains systems and follows procedures. That's it." Thompson leaned back with satisfaction. These civilian contractors sometimes forget their place. Important to maintain boundaries. But Williams wasn't convinced. Military flight training created instincts hard to hide. The way Sarah moved, anticipated needs, positioned herself to observe without seeming to. It suggested aviation knowledge beyond maintenance work. If you believe every aviation professional deserves respect regardless of their current role, type respect in the comments below. Colonel Sarah Catherine Walsh had earned her position through 12 years of experimental flight testing that included aircraft so classified their existence was denied by 3 different government agencies. She'd flown prototypes that pushed the boundaries of physics, aircraft that could break the sound barrier in vertical climbs, stealth technology that rendered entire defense systems obsolete, hypersonic vehicles that could reach any target on Earth within an hour. But more importantly, she'd learned that experimental aviation success depended on team integration. The best pilots in the world couldn't safely test revolutionary aircraft without maintenance teams who understood both the technology and the mission. Experimental flying was collaborative by necessity. The most dangerous moments in test flight history hadn't come from mechanical failures. They'd come from communication breakdowns. When pilots dismissed maintenance concerns, when technical expertise was undervalued, when hierarchy prevented critical information from reaching decision-makers. Colonel Walsh had seen careers end and lives lost because someone's input was dismissed based on rank, age, or gender rather than technical merit. That's why Edwards AFB's concerning patterns weren't just personnel issues, they were flight safety crises waiting to happen. 3 months ago, an experimental engine failure had been prevented only because a female maintenance technician ignored protocol and directly contacted the test pilot after her supervisor dismissed her concerns as overcautious. 2 months ago, a potentially catastrophic avionics malfunction was identified by a junior technician whose input had been repeatedly questioned during briefings. Each incident reinforced the same lesson. In experimental aviation, the person who saves your life might be the one everyone underestimates. Colonel Walsh's investigation wasn't about proving points or embarrassing anyone. It was about ensuring that America's most advanced aviation programs leveraged every qualified mind available. But she was discovering that organizational culture sometimes prevented exactly that integration. What came next would prove that assumptions about women in experimental aviation can be the most dangerous error. Major Thompson, Master Sergeant Chief Rodriguez joined their group. Noticed you discussing procedures loudly. Something we should address? Thompson considered carefully. Professional development, Sergeant. Sometimes civilian contractors need clear guidance about aviation hierarchy and appropriate roles. Maybe. Rodriguez watched Sarah efficiently manage 3 diagnostic workstations while staying aware of every conversation. But people with that situational awareness usually learned it somewhere specific. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah Catherine Walsh had been tracking concerning leadership patterns throughout her investigation. Thompson represented exactly the type of attitude that affected maintenance morale and flight safety. His dismissive approach toward support personnel created the environment where critical technical insights were ignored. For 1 week, she'd observed how expertise was valued at facility level, how respect was earned or demanded, how chain of command functioned when no field-grade officers were visible, how pilot ego affected team cooperation. Now she was experiencing it firsthand. Staff Sergeant Harrison approached Rodriguez quietly. Chief, been watching the new mechanic. Something doesn't add up. How so? Technical competence beyond her apparent training level. Yesterday, she identified a potential calibration issue with the X-47 prototype that our senior techs missed. Today, she's performing diagnostics using procedures I've only seen test pilots use. Rodriguez observed Sarah working. Efficient movements, unconscious attention to detail, spatial awareness suggesting tactical training. Military background? More than that. Watch how she processes information. That's not civilian technical training, that's military aviation command experience. What Harrison couldn't know was that Colonel Walsh had commanded experimental test operations at 3 different facilities. She'd overseen the development of aircraft systems that redefined America's strategic capabilities. She'd made decisions affecting billions of dollars in research and development. But more importantly, she'd learned to identify the subtle behavioral patterns that indicated leadership problems before they became flight safety issues. Thompson's attitude wasn't unique. It was representative of cultural problems that affected operational effectiveness throughout experimental aviation. The classified device buzzed again, fourth cycle indicating emergency escalation. That's when the test pilot emergency device rang for the fourth time. The sound cut through the hangar like an experimental aircraft scramble alert. Not a cheerful personal chime, but the distinct priority tone of America's highest experimental aviation command system. Every aviation professional in the test facility turned toward the sound. Sarah froze mid-diagnostic, looking at the device that connected her to the Pentagon's Experimental Flight Crisis Management Center. "Ma'am," Thompson called with full major authority, "I told you, personal calls wait until break time. Turn that off immediately." Sarah looked at the device ringing with test pilot command priority rhythm. 12 years of experimental flight command experience warred with her undercover investigation. "Major, with respect, this isn't personal." Sarah's voice carried quiet confidence that made Staff Sergeant Harrison pay closer attention. Thompson's face reddened. "I don't care what kind of call it is. You're contractor maintenance in an experimental aviation facility. When a test pilot gives direction, you follow. Period." The hangar went quiet. Aviation personnel at nearby stations stopped their procedures, sensing confrontation. Sarah's steady hands trembled slightly as she set down the diagnostic scanner. Inside her tool belt, the test pilot command device held 12 years of command authority over experimental aviation operations spanning America's most classified programs. "Major Thompson," Harrison tried. "Maybe she should—" "Harrison, stay out of this." Thompson's voice carried across the quiet hangar. "This is exactly what I meant. Civilian contractors who don't understand aviation hierarchy." Sarah looked around, taking in dozens of aviation professionals witnessing this public confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable. Others enjoyed the drama. A few seemed to be taking mental notes about leadership behavior. The device rang again, fifth cycle indicating experimental flight crisis escalation. "Ma'am," Thompson continued with full test pilot authority, "you have 10 seconds to silence that device and return to duties, or I'll have you escorted out and your facility clearance permanently revoked." "Sir," Captain Martinez spoke quietly, "maybe we should—" "Martinez, I'm handling this. Everyone's about to see how you maintain discipline and respect in experimental aviation environments." Thompson folded his arms. "Ma'am, I'm waiting." Sarah looked at the device. The secure communication system that had coordinated responses to experimental flight emergencies advised the Joint Chiefs on aviation strategy and participated in decisions affecting America's technological superiority. For 1 week, she'd observed how leadership functioned at facility level, how authority was exercised, respect earned or demanded, how command presence affected mission readiness when senior officers thought no one was watching from above. Now she was experiencing it firsthand. "Major Thompson," she said quietly, "you're absolutely right about aviation hierarchy and the importance of following legitimate flight protocols from qualified test pilots." Thompson nodded with satisfaction. "Exactly. Now please turn off—" "But you might want to know," Sarah continued, answering the device, "who you're giving aviation orders to. Colonel Walsh, Experimental Flight Test Command." The silence was total and immediate. Even jet engine test sounds seemed to pause as the words registered throughout the hangar. "Colonel Walsh, we have a developing crisis with the X-51 hypersonic prototype. Initial reports indicate potential flight control anomaly requiring your immediate assessment." Sarah's entire presence transformed. The blonde maintenance specialist disappeared, replaced by the commanding aviation authority of someone accustomed to decisions affecting national security. "What's the timeline for my evaluation?" 10 minutes, ma'am." "Test flight commanders are implementing emergency protocols, and we need your authorization before attempting emergency landing procedures." "Understood. Connect me to Major Peterson at Flight Test Operations immediately. I need all telemetry data and current aircraft status from the X-51 mission." While Sarah received the classified aviation briefing, she observed the transformation around her. Major Thompson had gone completely still, his face draining of color in dawning aviation horror. Staff Sergeant Harrison looked fascinated rather than shocked, as if diagnostic pieces were clicking into place. Other aviation personnel appeared to be experiencing various stages of professional disbelief, but Sarah's primary focus was on the crisis thousands of feet above. Colonel Walsh, we're tracking potential flight control malfunction in the X-51 during hypersonic test phase. Pilot reports intermittent response from primary flight systems. Current altitude 45,000 feet, speed Mach 3, 2 and decreasing. Sarah began pacing behind the maintenance station, her contractor uniform now completely at odds with the authority in her voice and the complexity of the aviation crisis she was managing. Current emergency protocol status? Emergency landing preparation at Edwards AFB, ma'am. Runway cleared, emergency services positioned. Pilot has regained partial flight control but requesting priority landing clearance. Recommendation: immediate implementation of Protocol X-ray for experimental aircraft emergency. All test flight operations suspended until X-51 is safely on ground. If flight control degrades further, pilot has authorization for emergency ejection over designated recovery zone. Protocol X-ray implementation: yes, ma'am. Secretary of Defense requesting your assessment on flight test program suspension. Tell the Secretary that one anomaly doesn't indicate systemic failure, but we suspend all hypersonic testing until complete analysis of X-51 incident. Safety protocols demonstrated their effectiveness. That's why we have emergency procedures. Major Thompson finally found his voice, barely a whisper. Colonel? Sarah held up one finger, indicating she needed to complete the flight emergency coordination. Around the hangar, aviation personnel at other stations began realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Phones were quietly retrieved. Conversations stopped entirely. Colonel Walsh, pilot confirms successful emergency landing. X-51 is safely on ground with no injuries. Initial assessment suggests software anomaly rather than hardware failure. Excellent news. Comprehensive investigation before any flight test resumption. And get me secure connection to General Morrison at Air Force Flight Test Center. We need immediate review of all experimental flight protocols. Understood, Colonel. Secure connection to General Morrison. Sarah ended the call and looked around the completely silent hangar. Every face was turned toward her, expressions ranging from aviation shock to professional awe to terrified recognition. She turned to Major Thompson, still staring with the expression of someone watching their aviation career disintegrate in real time. Major Thompson, I believe you had concerns about civilian contractors understanding aviation protocols? What followed was the most uncomfortable 40 minutes in Major Thompson's 9-year test pilot career. Colonel Sarah Catherine Walsh, still wearing her fitted maintenance coveralls, conducted an impromptu aviation leadership evaluation that would become legendary throughout the Air Force's experimental flight program. Aviation professionals, she began, addressing the 8 personnel who remained at their stations while other maintenance staff quietly evacuated to give them privacy. What happened today wasn't an aviation accident. It was the predictable result of leadership attitudes I've been documenting at this facility. Staff Sergeant Harrison leaned forward, his aviation training engaging. Colonel, what exactly have you observed? Systematic patterns of discrimination based on appearance, gender, and perceived aviation status rather than actual competence. Troubling tendency to dismiss input from anyone considered lower in flight hierarchy. Sarah pulled out a small aviation notebook. I've documented 19 incidents of test pilots making flight safety decisions based on assumptions about maintenance staff, gender, or contractor status, rather than demonstrated aviation capability. Major Thompson felt his flight career prospects evaporating. Ma'am, I never intended any aviation disrespect. Major, aviation intentions matter less than flight safety impact. Test pilot leadership effectiveness is measured by how behavior influences mission readiness, crew cooperation, and aviation outcomes. Sarah flipped through her notes. Your interaction with me today was consistent with patterns I've observed in your aviation leadership style throughout this week. She turned to Harrison. Staff Sergeant Harrison, you consistently questioned aviation assumptions and advocated for procedural verification. That's the critical thinking that creates effective aviation leadership. Harrison felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Being praised by the colonel commanding experimental flight operations was career-enhancing. Being praised for questioning a major's aviation authority in front of that colonel was potentially career-ending. Captain Martinez, you showed discomfort with today's conversation direction, but weren't willing to speak up when witnessing inappropriate treatment of someone you believed had no aviation authority to defend themselves. That's a leadership failure with serious flight safety consequences. Sarah closed her notebook. Here's what happens next. Major Thompson, you'll report to General Morrison's office at 1400 hours today. Your comments about maintenance staff, aviation competence, and appropriate treatment indicate immediate need for test pilot leadership development and bias recognition training. Thompson nodded numbly, calculating damage to his flight advancement potential. Staff Sergeant Harrison, you'll join me for discussion about advanced aviation leadership opportunities. Your willingness to question conventional flight thinking indicates potential for strategic-level aviation responsibility. All of you will participate in comprehensive facility aviation climate assessment. This includes confidential input from all levels: maintenance staff, support personnel, test pilots, and flight officers. Sarah stood, her contractor clothes somehow failing to diminish the aviation command presence radiating from her athletic frame. Aviation professionals, modern experimental flight operations require leaders who recognize aviation talent regardless of packaging. The ability to see beyond surface appearances and initial assumptions isn't political correctness. It's flight safety necessity. She looked directly at each aviation professional. Today you had the opportunity to demonstrate those aviation qualities. Some succeeded, others failed dramatically. This morning's incident will become a case study in test pilot leadership programs throughout the Air Force. Not because Major Thompson failed to recognize a colonel, but because he failed to treat another aviation professional with basic dignity and respect. Harrison raised his hand. Colonel, what changes do you recommend for Edwards? Edwards Air Force Base becomes a pilot program for inclusive aviation leadership development. We'll prove that flight safety improves when every aviation professional is valued for actual contributions rather than perceived status or appearance. The experimental test program will be expanded and formalized. Aviation expertise in specialized systems, flight safety advocacy, and mission coordination will be systematically integrated. Most importantly, we'll train test pilots to recognize and develop aviation talent wherever they find it. As she walked toward the hangar exit, still wearing her maintenance coveralls but now carrying herself with unmistakable colonel authority, the remaining aviation staff sat in stunned silence, each contemplating how a simple system diagnostic had fundamentally changed their understanding of aviation leadership, assumption, and the dangerous cost of underestimating aviation professionals based on appearance. 6 months later, the colonel in coveralls had become Air Force legend. Major Thompson received transfer to flight training instruction at Randolph Air Force Base, effectively ending his experimental test pilot advancement possibilities. His evaluation included mandatory bias, recognition training, and ongoing supervision requirements. But the impact extended far beyond one pilot's career. Staff Sergeant Harrison was promoted to Technical Sergeant ahead of schedule and assigned to Pentagon aviation planning, where his demonstrated ability to question flight assumptions proved invaluable in preventing 2 potential experimental aircraft safety crises. Captain Martinez received additional test pilot leadership development focused on moral courage, the strength required to speak up when witnessing inappropriate treatment of aviation colleagues. The Edwards incident became the centerpiece of a new Air Force-wide program called Aviation Leadership Beyond Appearance. The program trained test pilots to recognize flight talent regardless of gender, age, or maintenance status, proving that flight safety depended on seeing beyond surface aviation assumptions. Colonel Sarah Catherine Walsh was promoted to Brigadier General 6 months later, becoming the highest-ranking female experimental flight officer in Air Force history. Her promotion ceremony was held at Edwards Air Force Base, with over 300 aviation professionals in attendance. Aviation leadership requires the humility to recognize that flight wisdom can come from unexpected sources, she said during her speech. It requires the courage to question your own aviation biases, especially about the worth and capability of other flight professionals. The experimental test program at Edwards expanded to include former aviation executives, retired specialists, and experienced flight professionals whose civilian aviation expertise enhanced mission readiness in ways traditional military flight training sometimes couldn't address. But the most significant change was cultural. The incident sparked Air Force-wide conversations about aviation respect, assumption, and hidden potential in every flight professional. Test pilots questioned their biases more carefully, maintenance staff felt more valued, missions experienced improved safety and greater aviation advocacy. The goal wasn't to embarrass anyone or prove points about hidden aviation identities, General Walsh explained to a military aviation leadership conference. The goal was creating aviation leaders who see flight professionals clearly, value contributions based on aviation merit rather than appearance, and understand that our flight strength comes from recognizing and developing aviation talent wherever we find it. Edwards Air Force Base's main hangar installed a small bronze plaque near the maintenance station. Aviation excellence is best measured not by how you treat those with authority over you, but by how you treat those who appear to have no flight power at all. Every day, aviation professionals sharing hangar space were reminded that everyone around them carried flight stories, experiences, and aviation capabilities that couldn't be judged by uniform, job title, or first aviation impression. Sometimes the person maintaining your aircraft commanded entire experimental programs. Sometimes the quiet observer had flight insights that could save lives and advance American aviation superiority. Sometimes the most powerful aviation leader in the hangar was the one everyone aeronautically underestimated. Thank you to everyone who shared where they're watching from. Aviation lovers from around the world represent. Your comments prove that respect for our military aviators spans every corner of the globe. In the hangars and in the skies, true leadership always finds a way to soar. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the quiet strength that protects our freedom.